I like that positivity. And on that note, I guess I'm going to go ahead and get started. Hi, everybody. Thanks for listening in on our conversation. Um, my name is Ali Al Khatib. I'm the director of the Center for Applied Data Ethics at the University of San Francisco. Uh, I'm really excited that I get to introduce our next speaker. Xiaowei Wang is the creative director of Logic Magazine, which is this really exciting like publication that it takes a critical and also like really generative view of technology and its effects on people, and has like a really interesting theme every somewhere my last edition or issue is somewhere around here, but like they have a really interesting theme every issue that like basically ties all of it together and has like a coherent thread, which is just super awesome. They're also running the Logic School, which is a school for tech workers who are basically building change in the tech industry. It's a super exciting. It sounds like, I mean, like I'm sure that they'll talk more about it themselves, but like it from talking to them about it, it's like this really exciting sort of radical way of getting tech workers sort of caught up on a lot of the theory and thinking surrounding solidarity and moving forward and making the world a better place by thinking more deeply about how technology affects people who don't have power, and or who get disempowered by these technologies. So I was just like so excited, and I'm I was really excited about Blockchain Chicken Farm because it's, I mean, like if you haven't read it, I think I've tweeted about like podcast like interviews and things like that where like they've talked about it, but like just Xiaowei's writing is so it does like this thing where like on one hand it's incredibly personal and narratively like rich. Like there was, I'm like I won't do readings, I'm sorry, I won't do that. But then there's also like they take a step back and they do like this really interesting structural description of like how the entire sort of world in the sort of blockchain usage of food, of the like sort of tree kind of works. And it's just like I don't know that many people that can tell a personal story like that and also in the same breath tell this structural story about like how the broader ecosystem works. So I was just like totally thrilled when they said that they would come and give a talk, and like just tell me about anything that they're working on. They're a PhD student at UC Berkeley as well, but that's like sorry, there's just so many amazing things that they're doing. And so with that, I'll just cede the floor because I'm just rambling at this point. So without further ado, Xiaowei Wang.
Thank you so much for that very generous introduction. I feel like we're going to have so much fun this afternoon, just because if I already see two familiar names in the attendee list. So yeah, I feel like it can just be like a fun, formal discussion. There's also people, one person, Maggie, I think you're like later on in the like academic hierarchy. So it's also intimidating presenting in front of people who are more advanced than you, but I will give it a whirl. So I have to admit, originally I was going to talk about China more, and I will still talk about China, but I think there's a lot of kind of interesting threads that I want to open up for discussion. So yes, I actually worked in tech for a long time as a software engineer and designer before going back into academia, and it's been this great space to really just have a lot of autonomy. And before that, before working in tech, I was actually doing a lot of community art tech projects. So community mapping workshops around air quality, which was actually censored data in China in 2012. And so we were using kites to protest this. Also, the Nomadic Mapping Collaborative, which was thinking through mapping and data ownership in Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia. And currently running Logic School, which has its own fascinating, really interesting set of, I guess you could say, findings, just being back in the space of working with current tech workers who are trying to think through organizing, watching people's jaws drop when they learn about racial capitalism, and you can just see like all the connections in their minds, like, oh my God, this all makes sense now. That's been really thrilling. So I would say that generally my work, this book, The Charisma Machine, I really admire it. If y'all haven't read it, you should definitely check it out. I feel like a general arc of my work is pushing up against this idea of tech for social good. So everything like Facebook Free Basics to, Project Loon and all these like techno-deterministic solutions to social problems. And so some of the things that I end up thinking about in very concrete ways is data as ultimately a form of representation, that context matters. And I'll just highlight a framework that I've found really helpful in thinking through actually the broader landscape of algorithms and data. And then I think in terms of like where the theory lands on the ground for me is the fact that we are all connected by and benefit from the relationships set up by information capitalism. And I think relations, trust, kind of these foundation building ways are a good way to start and intervene. Not that teaching and creating theory isn't intervention in itself, of course, right? So actually, I just wanted to show very quickly, like, what do I mean by representation? And so I am in the geography department, and this is what I end up thinking about a lot. This is actually image of work that I did alongside Sol Kim and Rafael Avila. It's part of this NASA project on monitoring wastewater and sediment discharge off of the coast of Belize. And so this project, the challenge was really trying to think through ways of collecting data that were less expensive and could perhaps be automated, systematized. And this is compared to current ways of collecting wastewater data, which literally means going out on a boat, kind of traveling around, taking this Secchi disc where you put in the water and kind of try and monitor the cloudiness of the water through visual observation, right? But of course, with the advent of satellite data, we can start to monitor and look at these things remotely. So for this project, we were using Landsat 8, which is this satellite, and it has multiple bands of imagery. And so what you can do with it is actually start to see things like vegetation or, concrete or, different materials through Landsat 8 satellite imagery. And each pixel in this imagery is actually 30 meters. And so, when you start to the Landsat 8, it has a new image of the Earth every 16 days or so. And so it's this way where you're like, oh, we can apply data science to it. We could have this great machine learning pipeline, all these things to establish correlation between stuff that's happening upstream of this. So you see this river delta. So it's draining into the Caribbean, basically. We can analyze upstream all the different correlative effects and what's causing this. And, it could be this really tidy story, right, of using tech for social good, monitoring pollution in Belize, things like that. But as a geographer, right, I always think about how maps and even satellite imagery, it's not the truth. It's, there's power embedded in maps, and even the ways that we show the world in different projections, that has power as well, right? Different land masses appear larger than others, but there's often times where we mistake the map for the territory. So, when I teach undergrads, it's always we look at this satellite image and we're I ask them well, what is this, right? And oftentimes people will respond it's water, it's a river, it's the Caribbean. And we step back and I'm actually, that's all incorrect. This is an image of the river, right? It's the image of the Caribbean Ocean. And I think that reminder is helpful, right? All of these things are images, just like the data that we collect is. And so with the map not being the territory, I think a reminder of the fact that, that the ground truth and even just this image of the ground truth, there's always a gap between that and very different things. And of course, towards the end of this project for NASA, it was really interesting because, I'm more in the social science realm, and there were these typical questions coming up like, well, we have all this data about pollution and turbidity in wastewater. What's causing it? What can we do about it? And of course, the answer ends up being like, well, traces of colonialism. It's not like a technical problem that's causing all these things. It's like this longer embedded social history, right? So to counter actually this image of the satellite, one of the things that I've become really interested in recently is actually, I'll just let this play in the background, is using microscopes. And so I think using microscopes is this reminder that the tools that we use to collect data actually have a lot of impact and effect on what we count as data in the end, right? So this is actually a microscope that's built by Jeffrey U. Warren, who's a co-founder of Public Lab. And I'm very much inspired by his work and what he calls predecessor science. And he built this microscope, it connects to your computer and it can start recording, whatever you put underneath it. So these are actually images of plants, seeds, liquid, ocean water, and just providing a very different world in contrast to the satellite view. As part of these instruments, Jeff also says that he's interested in creating tools that sense and create different worlds instead of just tools that classify or provide the basis for a science that tries to dominate. So I think it is really fascinating that like underneath the microscope, all these things become like its own landscape and can talk about like other forms of data. So I'll get to China now. I know it feels like how are all these things connected? But in my mind, they're definitely connected. So with, I think, this kind of understanding how the tools of collecting data can kind of shape your worldview, I think there's also the importance of understanding, who builds narrative around certain things, who has the power to build certain narratives. And one thing in both the AI ethics community, data ethics community that's been really kind of taking off in recent years is this narrative that like China is authoritarian, the panopticon is already here. You have both congressional reports to popular news articles. I'm sure you've seen them at some point. And all of these are built on a narrative, which I think is really a techno-orientalist narrative, that China has global influence in tech and is going to spy and surveil all of us. And it really conflates the tech companies with Chinese state power. This is a framework. It's the Algorithmic Ecologies framework. It's from the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition and Free Radicals. And I think that this framework has been really helpful for me in thinking through just exactly how to map the different locuses of power inherent in any kind of algorithm, any product. And I think having that context of everything that we're sort of up against, right? Like from settler colonialism to, specific agencies that are contributing to and part of an algorithm or piece of software, that feels very crucial because, all these news stories, like this is already manufacturing a kind of nationalism and in the US and in China. And that nationalism also is the same thing that allows, Mark Zuckerberg to go to Congress and kind of say, you shouldn't regulate Facebook, because if you do, you'll have to deal with the Chinese like pushing ahead and, taking over the world through their tech. So it's important to understand, I think, the context and where power is. So in my book, I talk specifically, thinking through these ideas of how data is made, data is collected, the limitations of that, data as representation through visiting an urban village. These are actually images of an urban village that I visited in Beijing in 2008. And, at the time, it was places like this still existed in Beijing before the government decided to, quote unquote, do cleanup. And I think it's the same sort of mantra that pervades many cities throughout the world, this idea of, revitalization, gentrification, making things, quote unquote, nicer, right? And these urban villages in China are often homes to migrants, so rural migrants that move from the countryside into the city in search of waged labor. They often send money back home. This is common throughout China, and migrants have been pivotal to the economic success story of China over the past 30 years. Shenzhen, the electronics manufacturing hub that makes 90% of the world's electronics, would not be possible without the rural migrants of Shenzhen. And the specific urban village that I visited during this travel for the book was in Guiyang, Guizhou, which has these beautiful karst mountains in the background, kind of foggy, really idyllic place. And they've really modeled themselves as the center, the cutting edge center of big data and computing. There is a both terrifying and hilarious convention every year that they hold. That's called like the Guizhou International Big Data Expo, where people kind of show how big data is improving people's lives on the ground. And of course, as you might guess, the truth is far more complex. So this is an image of taken from a news source of like how they imagine this new world to look like in Guiyang. So lots of CCTV cameras, kind of this control center, very like 1970s socialist project Cybersyn. Everything is like automated. And so I actually have images of the police station, but I prefer not to put them up. And so this is essentially, what they're using at these police stations in the urban villages. They use these aerial satellite images, and it's actually really interesting. So the police officer I talked to, he was this young police officer who was supposed to really reform the policing system, specifically in Guiyang. And a lot of the times he was just referencing these ideas of modernizing as the imperative to the work that he was doing, like why they were using computing systems. The more that I dug into it, this is why nationalism is so dangerous, right? They were like, oh, well, we have to do this because in the US, policing is so modern, it's so scientific, and we have to catch up in China. So there is also that very fascinating dynamic. So the platform that they're using in Guiyang is called the Real Population Platform. And so because many of these urban villages have informal settlements, so they'll have buildings that are built by the landlords that are not just necessarily registered with city officials in any way. They just have like high-res drone photography, and you can kind of click on each of these buildings and a small pop-up will happen and there will be the list of people registered for each of those buildings. The policing is extremely targeted towards these urban villages and towards rural migrants because according to the police officer I talked to, that's where 70 to 80% of all crime in the city happens, right? And especially for the rest of the city population, people who live in the quote unquote nicer areas, they often view these rural migrants as like of lesser quality, so poorer, prone to, like I was told, like prone to getting into fights. There's this set of cultural, very derogatory like cultural attributes attached to them as a migrant group. And so the urban policing force has become, like, unfortunately, really concentrated in these urban villages. So one of the things that was really interesting is that I think, there's so much talk about these CCTV monitoring. This is actually from an art piece called Dragonfly Eyes by Xu, and it's an entire movie that's made up of CCTV camera footage. But when I talked to the police officer, I had imagined some kind of really sophisticated, computer vision setup that was tracking people. I had imagined that, for the satellite imagery, like, they were trying to find like houses and different types of structures using computer vision. It turns out it was not the case at all. I was told by the police officer that there were so many complications in actually, one, collecting data for this. A lot of the migrants, rural migrants, they were, some of them are illiterate, so they actually didn't know how to register on this platform. And they would have to, like, send a police officer out and knock on doors on many of the houses. When they first built this platform, the builders of the platform, which was this small startup in Guiyang, actually had a lot of issues with like duplicated data because a lot of people had the same names, or they, it was one person with multiple addresses. And so it was really interesting to just see like all these technical tensions come up against, the surveillance state. Actually made it, I think in many ways more terrifying if you've ever seen the movie Brazil, where like one small, technical error ends up causing a whole cascade of effects. So yeah, I think that those for me were the really fascinating set of takeaways, right? So that even in this kind of perception of China as, this perfect, like well-oiled authoritarian surveillance state, that on the ground, this data about people needed to be collected, chased down, massaged, tidied, all these things, right? And, very similar to the point that I made earlier, that all of these things, this data about people, it was simply a representation of people. It was not them themselves. Actual data compatibility, it always looks worse when it's, it looks terrible no matter which country you're in. But I think despite the US-China like tensions, if you look beyond that lens, right, like it always looks worse when you can have this like outsider perspective. And it also, when I started looking at the different connections, it was scary to see how much of it wasn't just a Chinese surveillance industry, but really a global surveillance industry. So the Real Population Platform, the system that I just described, that was made by a small startup in Guiyang. It was like 20-something-year-olds. And they were super excited to have their first government contract. If you've ever worked at a small startup, you're kind of just like, we got business, yay. Okay, now we have to build this thing. Maybe we kind of oversold our product, so we'll just kind of plod along. And they didn't have a good sense of the broader, socioeconomic context that they were making the software in, right? And it was this situation where it was just like, oh, these software engineers, they're just trying to do their jobs, they're like stressed out, they're trying to like, build this product that they had overpromised. And I think to me that was a harsh and sad reality. Similarly, during the process of writing Blockchain Chicken Farm, I also got to visit the Face++ offices. And so this company had been written about extensively, I think also in The Economist, as the kind of prime example of the Chinese surveillance state. And, once I got there, it was extremely similar to any kind of mid-sized startup in the Bay Area, right? So they were totally aware of the negative press coverage in the West. A lot of the PR people who worked for them used to work at the Wall Street Journal in the Beijing office and had moved towards Face++ because it was far more lucrative to be PR at a tech company than at the Wall Street Journal. And Face++ also makes China's Skynet surveillance system, which is supposed to have outposts across rural regions. And they also make the algorithm that does like a makeup in photo touch-up apps. So they really made it clear to me that they just make the algorithm for face recognition. They don't store any of the data. And they were kind of trying to push this idea that, whatever data gets put into their algorithm or like whatever their algorithm is used for, whether it's a photo touch-up app or the government, they feel like it's not their responsibility. They're just trying to get business done. And the more that I looked into it, right, a lot of these companies like Hikvision, SenseTime, these companies based in China that are doing facial recognition actually have a slew of foreign investment. So SenseTime's investors include Qualcomm, Fidelity International, Silver Lake Partners based in Menlo Park, as well as Japan's SoftBank Vision Fund. And so when we think about, the algorithmic ecology of this one particular thing, it's actually astounding how global that footprint does become and how actually nationalism becomes this way to obfuscate this global story, really. So I think this will not be new to a lot of the folks who are here at the talk, but I think the idea of quantification is definitely something that really applies in this context when we think about data collection. When I talked about the difficulties that the police officer was facing in actually collecting data about people on the ground, they were starting to think through like different metrics that they could have about the city blocks, the neighborhoods, things like that. And quantification definitely plays into this. It gave them a sense that by using this computer platform and applying metrics, that their work was somehow becoming more modern or scientific. And of course, one thing that I do want to say is that I approach all of this work, not just through the lens of individual privacy. And I think that's something that's really interesting that's emerging now, right? In these discourses around fairness, ethics, and bias, right? Is that we're trying to go beyond this idea of privacy at the individual level, but really starting to think about like, well, if we think about data critically, right, through these other frameworks, like you start to see who is actually excluded from the protections and notions of privacy more generally, like marginalized people, people who are seen as criminal. And you also start to think about who has the power to designate that. And so I believe very strongly that throughout this research, it's not just about bias. It really requires recognizing that there's a right to privacy everywhere. It's not at an individual level. So I think just to end, I'll talk a little bit about where my research is headed. And if anyone is interested, I would love to connect about this. So my research is, new research is actually looking at software as a medical device. This is kind of a continuation because I feel like for Blockchain Chicken Farm, I was looking at issues of food safety and how blockchain was being used to tackle the issue of food safety in China, but of course dovetailed with all these bigger dynamics surrounding the increasing industrialization of farming and commodity prices, things like that, that were putting pressure on small farmers. And so creating this food safety issue. And a couple other chapters of the book also look at urban-rural dynamics and the interconnections between agriculture and food safety in China. So now, I think continuing with the embodied and health, sort of embodied human things that we put in our bodies strain of research, I'm now looking at software as a medical device, which was actually a category established by the FDA more recently. So in 2016, the 21st Century Cures Act actually created this like strange new regulatory landscape for digital therapeutics that had not previously existed. So what I mean by digital therapeutics is, the FDA, they regulate something like Prozac, and that's a pill. But they also regulate this new class of digital therapeutics, software as a medical device, which can be something like a cognitive behavioral therapy thing that is helping you monitor your own behavior and giving you recommendations. And so the patient outcomes for both Prozac and this app might be the same, but they're regulated in very different ways. And so with Prozac, you would have a series of clinical trials before anything ever went to market. With software as a medical device, all of that regulation is kind of like, well, I guess you can't really do anything with your app until it goes to market and starts collecting real world data, right? So the FDA is kind of just letting these apps go to market with pre-certified companies and allowing these apps to start collecting data immediately, because the argument is, you need large amounts of patient data in order to make better recommendations. Many of these digital therapeutic apps, they're targeted towards diseases that are chronic in nature, things like diabetes, heart disease, also opioid addiction treatment is another one of these. And it's this really interesting, brave new world, really, where the US Food and Drug Administration is like grappling with, well, how do we regulate these therapeutics that oftentimes employ some kind of algorithm? Diabetes diagnosis often uses, I guess, what you would call like an equation or an algorithm. But it's really, really unclear, like what the entanglements and implications of this new kind of these new kinds of digital therapeutics are. So I will just end it there. I know it was like 3 very disparate topics, but I'm happy to talk about anything in the presentation or also logic school related, what it's like watching software engineers learn about racial capitalism and intersectionality. It's been really exciting. So yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much for giving this talk. I'm like, so I have a notebook, or not even a notebook. It's like a pad, and I just like write a bunch of random notes as like as interesting things come up, and I just have like this is covered with like things. So I'll say, okay, I will say to people, if you have any questions, feel free to ask it in the Q&A. But I am going to like take the first question. Yeah, I mean, like I guess like so one of the things that sort of comes to mind. This is a I feel bad saying this. This is more of a comment than a question. Is like you mentioned Belize and like a lot of the satellite sort of like work going on, and it just reminded me of so I, like many years ago, I was an archaeologist and I worked in Belize. And at the time, LiDAR was like just becoming like a big thing. And for people who aren't familiar, LiDAR is this technology that like scans the ground. And it was like this thing that was like super exciting to figure out like sort of where archaeological sites might be in like really densely jungly kind of areas. And it was sort of funny because like I was at this conference and like listening to somebody talk about how exciting it was, but like literally every site that anybody talked about before and after that talk was like, so a local told us there might be a location here. And that was it. That was how all of the sites get found. Like that somebody who lives there is like, oh yeah, there's definitely something there. It's a mound and we all know about it. And it just like struck me that like for all of this technology, and this was like back in 2010, like it was still very clearly the case that the people who live in that area, who live in a place know much more than like this like literally top down view could possibly provide. And it was just like so it's so interesting like hearing this like thread that like brings all of this together, because it had honestly not never occurred to me that that was like a metaphor for how you could think about how like surveillance technology around the world is like manifesting and all of this other stuff. And I really really like that. So that's like my not quite question. I do see a question that somebody has here. So I basically what I do is I usually read them out, and then I'll go ahead and let you take the floor. So Lena asks, I'm trying to understand the justification for having a different approval process. Why can't apps have something similar to clinical trials?
That's a really great question. So there's kind of two reasons. Um, so how basically the line in the US is if health insurance will cover a treatment, it is worth it. The pharmaceutical company is like super excited if the insurance company covers it, and it will like actually end up in the hands of patients. Um, there's like an independent health technology assessment organization that like will make all these assessments. And so one of the things that it gets complicated with digital therapeutics is like they're like, well, we don't know how to assess this thing, right? That's like basically more like patient like choice based, right? Like it's, you know, if you're trying to do a digital therapeutics for diabetes, it's based on like these little nudges and like, oh, you should like take 10 steps or something like that. And so so from that end, right, these digital therapeutics companies are all kind of like scrambling to prove their worth. But in order to make these recommendations to the end user of like, here's what works, you know, in all of our patients, like here's, you know, 10 things that definitely like will help you decrease your blood glucose score, right? In order to arrive at that conclusion, they need like thousands and thousands and thousands of people using this app to on, I think, a data level, say like we can make this recommendation. For clinical trials, I think it's like something absurdly low that was changed in 2016. It's like 700 people, which is like not enough from the kind of recommendation standpoint to really make like a solid lifestyle recommendation. So it's really once the digital therapeutic app can get released to like a really broad set of people that the kind of recommendations start having better weight.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I did like I found myself wondering like how do they evaluate software as medical devices or software as medicine, and like it does strike me. I mean, maybe this is just like sort of me thinking that technology is special, but it seems like technology has the capacity to be harmful for so much longer than some other medical interventions. And so it would seem, at least like this is the concern that seems to come up a lot with the IRB, that like the collection and use of data can harm people way further out than IRBs typically think about when they think about like biological or psych sort of behavioral studies. And it seems, I don't know, it just seems a little bit nerve wracking that like they don't necessarily, that they're not necessarily thinking that robustly about it.
Yeah. It's really interesting actually. So they started like a pre-certification pathway, the FDA, and so they're pre-certifying like these 10 large companies that are like Google, Apple, and a few other companies like Pear Therapeutics, and they're just basically saying like you show like a general, sense of like what you're doing, basically like HIPAA compliance, like general patient safety, and like a proven, like vague proven track record. And so we'll pre-certify you. You can release these apps to market that will have like an FDA approved stamp. And then any further updates to this app, or if you want to build new apps, like you will be on like the fast track. So it's this like super weird consolidation of power. On the other hand, there's also, I think, people who make the argument like, well, the long-term effects of something like a pill, that's like, bodily damage. But like, with an app, it's like, yeah, maybe, it won't work and your diabetes gets worse and worse. But in that case, we can just say it's like patient non-compliance instead of the drug. It's very
Oh no.
twisted.
Okay. Wow. That's awful. Okay. Well, sorry. So Maggie asks, or says, fun talk. Thank you. I resonate with your approach of criticizing Chinese state surveillance while refusing to other it. Could you go further and make more explicit your take on the US-China geopolitics of tech rhetoric?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something I've been thinking about all week because there was actually a workshop on this. And it's really tough, right? Because it's like, on one hand, you know, China is, doing all these things that are horrible human rights violations. And on the other hand, especially using tech as part of that process. And then on the other hand, like, both US and China have become so like politically and economically entangled that I think policymakers don't know what the right policy is. And on top of like this increase in nationalism, right? Like you see Chinese newspapers all the time being like, look at the US, like evil capitalist imperialist policing system. And like, we don't have any of that here in China. Like everyone is treated so well, which is not true. So in terms of like, I guess my stance is like China bad, US bad, both bad, and need to find some like way of really addressing like this global surveillance tech industry capital, right? Like, how do we confront SoftBank? How do we confront all this VC money that actually is, I think, across both sides of the Pacific, contributing to these the acceleration of inequity and these deep social problems, right? But yeah, that might not be solved through simply just sanctions. Who knows?
Yeah. Yeah, that's really illuminating. I feel like that I also was sort of struggling with, yeah, sort of articulating a clear position on that. Emily asks, thanks for the talk. So many things. First, I'm curious what your perspective is on alternatives to individual privacy. Is there a quote unit of privacy that we should orient to instead?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So the reason why I said that about individual privacy is that I feel like for a long time, especially in San Francisco, when these debates around privacy come up, it's always the like, oh, the government is stealing your data type thing. And it always struck me as really odd that like, I, as an individual who is out in the world and, at Berkeley, should be afforded this individual privacy versus people who like are marginalized or maybe like have had some brush with like the carceral system, like are not afforded that sense of privacy. So I think, I mean, so many scholars have written about this, right, where it's very much relational and going beyond like the sort of like human rights model of it, where it's about like the individual and more about us as like a group, right? Where it's like, the people who are most impacted by these technologies, like everyone should be offered this. I think it also brings into question like, or this really interesting perspective on ideas of like community data ownership, and also makes us think outside of the like paternalistic, like big tech world where trust and safety teams are trying to, ensure that individuals' privacies aren't being compromised. Like maybe it also pushes us to think about like these other models of like interaction and tech use as well.
That's, yeah, super interesting. Lena asks, why the difference in the amount of the data required? Is there some mathematical justification for it, like that maybe there is more noise for vetting the app and less control? I think, is
I
this
think
in...
it's math. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to ask, is this in... I think this is in relation to the software as a medical device.
Oh
Oh,
yeah,
yeah.
I think it's mathematical. I mean, I think realistically, like if you're doing 700 people, like that, like given just the amount of noise, like the different variations in people's like different like uses of both recommendation and then what they're going to do in terms of lifestyle, like it's going to make like not be as helpful if it's just like 700 people versus like a couple thousand, I think. Also like not enough variance probably in a study of 700 people, which they're always concerned about.
Yeah. Emily asks, second on the SAMD work. SAMD work. One argument I've heard from techno-optimistic digital therapeutics folks is basically that nudges are less, quote, invasive. Behavioral interventions like smoking cessation are less potentially harmful than, say, a pacemaker, so a lower evidentiary threshold is acceptable. Do you think the right metaphor is software equals pill or software equals, e.g., life coach, and does it matter?
So I think that it's going to vary depending on like what the disease is and what typical interventions on the disease is. I think that so it's actually interesting to me that like pacemakers and the software that runs the pacemaker does not count as software as a medical device. And so there's actually like very traditional pathways that the FDA has for regulating that. And those do have to go through like different types of trials in the like more traditional drug sense. What's really fascinating is like, so when software as a medical device, it is less invasive, and you could actually definitely compare it more to like a life coach or your doctor, like every day, just being like, did you measure your blood glucose? Did you not eat candy? Things like that. But technically, the FDA is not supposed to regulate the how of medicine. That's kind of the line I've heard from people is the FDA regulates the objects of medicine or the pills, but they do not regulate the how. And so it is really, I think that kind of weird tension is really interesting to me, where it's like the digital therapeutic is definitely more like the life coach and the how. And yet if it doesn't work, it's kind of your fault as the patient.
Yeah, this feels like, I don't know, like at one point, like on one hand it is sort of like the how, or like it is the process, but it's also an artifact in a very concrete sense. And like, or in a very real sense. And like I feel, I mean, like, of course they have to like come up with some construct to like differentiate things from one another. And like, of course there are going to be things that I struggle with, but this feels really odd. Uh, uh, that's a super fascinating distinction. I feel like I'm going to have to like sit with that for a bit. Um, I, I am going back to like something that you mentioned earlier on in the talk when I think you were saying that you were talking to Face++ engineers, or maybe it was PR people who said that like they consider the company as mostly just like making the algorithm, and they sort of felt distant from like the moral responsibility of like how those systems are used. And I very acutely remember a conversation exactly like that happening at Stanford in grad school. And I'm really wondering, I guess like one, do you have a sense of, I guess like across fields too, because like you're in geography, and so you also have like different experiences from different fields as well. So one, I guess like, do you feel like there's a salient or sort of like clear difference among different fields? And then also, do you feel like there's been a change over time, like since your field work or since, I don't know, over any sort of duration?
Yeah, I mean, I'd be curious to hear from you if you feel like there's change over time. I think the optimistic part of me wants to feel like there's some change. I mean, I also remember like, it's been like 15 years since undergrad, but I remember like the CS 50 class at Harvard. And, it was just kind of like you do your problem sets and like, that's it. You go off into the world and solve problems, children. And now even just, I guess, seeing having undergrads take like ethics courses, or just even trying to understand capitalism and the context that they're operating in, or, all these like initiatives that are really burgeoning now. It feels like there is that change in terms of how much people feel like they can speak up at work. I think that's like still TBD, right? It's clearly still like extremely contested, as we're seeing every day, and has consequences. So I don't know. I'm curious if you feel like there's change over time.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like, I remember when I first got to Stanford, I feel like I had heard that kind of like, I just deal with the math, it's not really my problem kind of like pushback against conversations about ethics. And I think I do quite strongly think that things had changed by the time that I left, because I think that when somebody made that comment about the year, like within a couple of months of me leaving, I acutely remember that like the room fell silent when the person said that they felt like it wasn't their job to worry about the ethics because they only do the math. Like the rest of the group was sort of responded negatively to it. They didn't like pile on and say like, what's wrong with you or anything, but it was clear that like this person had said something transgressive, which was totally bizarre to me. Like I just did not believe that that would ever happen in a CS department. And like, it was like, I didn't like that the person said it, but like, the whole rest of the room was like, no, you're wrong. And that would not have happened 5 years earlier, I don't think. And I also think that like undergrads had, like, at least over the summers, were so motivated to talk about ethics, and were so dissatisfied with the conversations that they were getting from classes. And so like our reading group became like this like truly like literally overflowing sort of like ethics and history class, like seminar kind of thing, because people were dramatically more interested like year over year, and it just kept growing and growing. And so I don't know what things are like last summer, but I imagine that they were probably continuing to grow. So I do have hope that like interest is sort of moving forward. I do see a couple of questions, and so I'm just gonna like let those be the last two. So Kyle says, great talk, thank you. I've heard a lot of characterizations of people in China and all of Asia in the past year and before as having a more collective spirit or attitude, thus more success battling COVID. What is your understanding of this in relation to the technology space in China, as well as of the geopolitics of tech? Are there compelling examples of collective data or tech in China?
So the collective spirit or attitude, I think, is definitely maybe more like Western projection. I think more the success, at least in the mainland People's Republic of China, is really due to extremely, extremely strict border controls. Like no one can go into China right now. Basically, as well as, I mean, a pretty authoritarian like state regime, which in big cities has a lot of control at the local level. So they can just, make people get up at 2 a.m. and go get a COVID test, like an entire neighborhood block, because there was one case at a market earlier. So that's definitely part of it. Taiwan is a different, very different realm, and I think held up as like the model of civic tech and COVID, battling COVID. But even there, the tech that they're using is actually pretty, I would say, unsophisticated. It's stuff like making it easier at the beginning to buy face masks. Also, if you were supposed to be quarantining, they would put up a geofence. Like they wouldn't track you and your location. They would just put up a geofence around your house. And they would come and be like, please don't leave your house. And in terms of collective data or tech in China, so it's actually, over the past few years, it's gotten kind of contested in terms of like repression, because the free and open source software movement in China can be at times seen as subversive. And if you're not subversive, you get co-opted by the state. And so you end up seeing really weird things like blockchain being part of state initiatives, and then free and open source gatherings kind of being cracked down upon. But of course, like people's personal opinions are going to be very different. They're just not publicly able to be mentioned. Yeah.
Interesting. And then I'll say that this is the last question. Somebody says, speaking about the software as a medical device work and about your first segment too, it's interesting that, quote, variation in the data is a rationale for larger data sets. When that's represented in data, it's inevitably just a representation. It seems like there's some tension between capturing more realistic nuances by capturing more data and the problems of amassing a large data set. And I wonder if you had thoughts on better ways to talk about this.
Yeah, so I can point folks to, it's called, it's this article by K.O. Lu Fox, and it's called The Illusion of Inclusion. And it was written for the New England Journal of Medicine. And he's a genetic scientist, so he's thinking about genetic data. But it's this really interesting thing where it's like, okay, well, we don't have enough variation in the data, so let's like include more diverse populations, et cetera. And it's this illusion of inclusion because it's not that, I think it's really interesting because he's an indigenous data scientist, and he's like, the issue isn't like, okay, we need more data. Like the questions are really important, right? But the equity issue also comes in who's receiving the benefits. So it's like, okay, if you need lots of data, if you need more variation in data, great. But like, at the end of the day, for software as a medical device, the people who are receiving the benefits, aka profits, are really going to be these tech companies. And even like in a smaller way, if there was like more like equitable benefits sharing, like different shareholder models or stakeholder models, that would be a very different realm, right? So I think that like kind of benefits and where power is going is a helpful way to frame it.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks so much. Okay, I think we're slightly over time, and I want to be respectful of everybody's time commitments and everything like that. So I'll just say thank you so much, Xiaowei, for coming and giving this talk. This has been totally fascinating, and I have so much to think about, and this has just been really, really great. And I want to thank everybody for attending and asking questions that really lent themselves to being spoken aloud. That does not always happen, and it was really nice to not stumble over all of them. So thank you all so much for asking such great questions, like both substantively and rhetorically. Yeah, thank you all so much again for coming and attending this talk. With that, I'll let you all get going, and I'll see you at the next one.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.